Whether you support the US's military expansion or not, its presence around the world is felt by millions, and its foreign base count exceeds that of any known empire in world history. So why does the US military have bases everywhere? In order to understand how we got to where we are today, we need to know where we began. As a fledgling nation, forts were the first thing a US citizen saw when acquiring a new territory, often preceding neighborhoods and local government. The Founding Fathers understood that this new civilization would collapse if unprotected. In the beginning, the U.S. established outposts like Jefferson Barracks in 1826 and naval yards in locations like Boston, Brooklyn, and Philadelphia. In the 19th century, the U.S. territory was so vast that it started to resemble a large confederation of small countries, prompting the government to lay out bases strategically to ensure domestic stability in all developing regions. By 1862, internal base growth had reached an all-time high, with conflicts like the Plains Indian Wars and the Mexican Cession leading to the creation of key military strongholds, such as Fort Sill, Oklahoma, Fort Sam Houston, Texas, and Fort Riley, Kansas. Soon after, the Spanish-American War of 1898 was the first conflict that sent the U.S. down the path to becoming an overseas empire. At the close of the war, the Treaty of Paris led to the acquisition of the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico as American territories. Prior to this, Congress was hesitant to pump money into foreign settlements of any kind, primarily focusing the military on establishing order in the states. Because of this, almost 50% of the United States' 200,000-man army was made up of National Guard units. The artillery count was low, and naval presence was equal to or less than what was found in countries like England, Germany, or France. Hypothetically, if two of the three decided to target the East Coast, the US would have been in a lot of trouble, and most likely would have turned into another failed democratic experiment. However, the rising conflict with Spanish generals like General Valeriano Weyler compelled this growing economic superpower to build its first permanent series of bases in Cuba, Hawaii, Guam, and the Panama Canal Zone at the start of the 20th century. With this, more trade routes were facilitated with Western allies. The United States was becoming a very rich country, and it became apparent that measures had to be taken to sustain that. By World War I, the U.S. was laying the groundwork to become one of the world's most fortified nation-states domestically as well, putting up bases like Fort Benning in Georgia and Fort Bragg in North Carolina, both of which became two of the largest training centers in the country. The focus was inward, not outward, a concept that the new generation would have a hard time believing. A USA determined to avoid intervention at any cost. It's important to understand that up until the late 1930s, a vast majority of the United States was composed of isolationists, meaning that they preferred to only involve themselves economically. There was a history of funneling resources for future financial benefit, but putting boots on the ground was considered to be excessive. Instead, the country continued to fortify itself with bases planted in San Diego, Los Angeles, and Pearl Harbor. The last one would eventually act as a gateway to the global fortification we see today. Now, compare that to the 57 territories, colonies, and dominions that the British Empire held at the same period, managing 20% of the world's populace. The world was a much different place. By 1940, President Franklin D. Roosevelt had settled negotiations with England in what would become known as the Destroyers for Bases Agreement. If the Spanish-American War and World War I were sparks that started widespread base construction, consider this piece of legislation a tub full of kerosene. This was the first real mass expansion, with the U.S. receiving 99-year leases to 8 British air and naval bases in Newfoundland, Bermuda, British Guiana, and 5 key Caribbean islands. Not only did this establish a long tradition of weapons trading, with the U.S. sending 50 destroyers across the sea, but also set the tone for the rest of the Great War and beyond. Naval superiority was paramount during World War II. Although the Treaty of Versailles forced Germany to surrender its U-boats, Adolf Hitler approved craft construction in 1935. In a matter of months, submarine warfare had become a ubiquitous concern for the Allies. During the war, a total of 1,162 U-boats were built to strike at a moment's notice. It was now more important than ever for countries with resources to spare to start assisting nations that had already exhausted themselves. Seizing the opportunity, the U.S. procured basing rights in Brazil, Morocco, Azores, Iceland, and Great Britain. in an effort to stave off the onslaught of submersibles coming from the Axis powers. These new bases would act as stable checkpoints in the Atlantic, as sending supplies to Great Britain and the Soviet Union had become extremely difficult. At this point, many were destitute, and U.S. assistance was the only thing keeping friendly forces afloat. In the heat of battle, these new bases served multiple purposes that Allies welcomed. Over in the Pacific, Japan was an absolute force, taking the Philippines, Dutch East Indies, New Guinea, Guam, and many more vital havens. Although not as effective as the Germans, they managed to sink 1 million tons of Allied merchant ship material in the supply chain. The US reacted quickly, establishing more bases for infantry and bombing expeditions in Australia, New Zealand, Britain, North Africa, Italy, China, and some Pacific islands. At this point, the US, as well as the rest of the Allied forces, were dealing with a logistical nightmare. It was no easy feat building bases to support and train more than 11 million men. With such limitations, rampant construction became an absolute necessity. It was also the beginning of joint bases, where Allies would share the burden of protecting posts necessary for when the time was right to fight back. This is how the US found its way into being the economic boon of the world. When the Axis powers were finally eliminated on September 2, 1945, the Allies found themselves with a unique opportunity. In a sense, civilization had to be rebuilt. The only problem was that the new leaders of the world had different visions for what this new civilization would look like. When Great Britain, France, the US, and the Soviet Union sat down to disperse the spoils of war, they were effectively establishing the New World Order. They started by carving up Germany into 4 occupation zones to be controlled by the 4 main victors. Immediately, it was clear that the Russians had big plans for Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Poland, and many other parts of the manageable territory nearest to them. During the war, many nations like Yugoslavia were proponents of communism, but not formally part of the Soviet expansion project. However, as time went on, it was clear who commanded the New East. As the final bit of dust settled in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, the Russian military presence was on the decline, but not enough for Western comfort. Even as men returned home, it was documented that the West was still outnumbered 10-1. The US was in yet another unique position. While it was clearly the new leader of the West, being on the top meant that defense was now the primary responsibility. News was circulating around Washington that the Russians could summon 8 million war-hardened troops within the span of a month. On March 5, 1946, Churchill would give a speech detailing the new threat to Westminster College in Fulton. The Iron Curtain was raised, and the Cold War had officially begun. The US was setting world records at this point, building an average of 112 foreign military installations per month. As arguably well-founded, paranoia peaked amongst the new superpowers. War was thought to be an inevitability, and much of the militaristic elite believed that a key point of vulnerability was the Fulda Gap, which sat in the middle of East and West Germany, a point that led directly from Russian territory into France and the English Channel. Other concerns of this nature would surface over the next decade, leading to a need for immediate deployment in the wake of a Red invasion. Thus began what many would eventually refer to as the policy of deterrence. It wasn't enough to simply warn the opponent anymore, something had to be done. Before these events, military growth was usually reactionary. When an imminent threat loomed, it was time to call on the laboring men of your country, and neighbors, to fortify for God and country. Now it was seen as a necessary constant, an insurance policy for the inevitable radioactive tempest that could tear through the capitalist half of Europe. Newly formed governments strapped for cash, especially in West Germany, all but begged for US base and embassy construction. At the height of the Cold War, the US had over 200 military installations across Germany's border wall alone. These countries bordering or connected to the Soviets believed that a US military presence would do for their country what gold once did for flat currency. When the barbarians were at the gates, they could call on the legions to preserve the Western legacy. The need was no different in East Asia. The following decades saw war break out in Korea and a strengthening alliance with Japan. The U.S. Air Force's Strategic Air Command, or SAC, bumped the bomber base count up from 19 to 30. At this point, the objective was to secure as much territory as possible. Most believed that war could spell the death of millions of civilians, and possibly total Armageddon. Bases were constructed in Greenland, Libya, England, Spain, Morocco, Korea, and the Philippines. That said, as the Soviets enhanced their missile defense, much of these launch zones became obsolete. By 1965, base count had ballooned from the Vietnam War, leading to major projects in Okinawa, Guam, and Luzon. This activity would eventually be referred to as the Empire of Bases strategy. Approaching the 21st century, the US-British interest in oil was at an all-time high. Little did they know that an opportunity would seemingly fall from the sky. On August 2, 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait. They owed their neighbor quite a bit of money, and Kuwait's oil reserves were considered the ultimate prize. This invasion triggered a wave of military installations along the Persian Gulf, supported by a coalition of 42 other countries. Over time, the increasing base number proved to be useful, if not vital, during operations like Desert Shield and Desert Storm. This is where base building had hit its absolute peak. But the end of the Cold War in the 1990s would cause many to question the need for US involvement. It was clear which country had become the next empire, and global outcry for the dismantling of military installations was at an all-time high. At this point, the general opinion was that the global giant was overstaying its welcome. However, while some base removal was quick and easy, like the withdrawal from Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines or Subic Bay, others like Okinawa would prove difficult. It became clear that the golden age of US base building was coming to an end. The question was how many were to remain, as some locations served and continue to serve as trade route security. Today, the US has more than halved their military installation count, bringing it down from about 1,600 to 750 in 2022, or so the record states. As the demand for base removal has increased in recent decades, the number might continue to drop. There are a fair number of abandoned US military installations that have become the subject of discussion all over the internet. Some examples include the Maunsell forts built in Thames and Mersey to protect the UK in World War II, Kalama Atoll built to store chemical weapons, and California's Suisun Bay, housing what has been dubbed the Ghost Ship Fleet. The abandonment of these bases has led to a variety of developments, and many of them have been less than positive. From the Ghost Ship Fleet contaminating the water to waste leaks in Greenland, the exodus has often been problematic for the environment. Also, there are cases where abandoned bases are transferred over to hostile entities like the Taliban when the US pulled forces in that fateful July of 2021. In truth, bases have been turned over or destroyed since the 1950s, but it's hard to determine how this makes a big difference, considering that they have started to build many more in recent years. Some are quick to draw a parallel between the British Empire and the proliferation of US bases, explaining that some of these territories are essentially British dominions with a different label. The belief is that the two nations passed the torch at the end of World War II. It's important to point out that Great Britain still has 145 bases spread out over 42 countries. China has plenty, but most of them are within the bounds of aggressive annexation, and Russia holds 21 notable stations. Many are in Balkan and Slavic territories. This is an interesting way to frame the dynamic, but the situation appears to be a bit more gray. Although the US reportedly reduced base count, the number of countries that host US bases have doubled from 40 to 80 countries over the last 3 decades. This suggests that base construction has become more organized, meaning that less bases are required to reach the same objectives. That, or maybe things aren't as organized as we once thought. When thinking about the future base count in the United States, there are 3 main factors that will inevitably play a key role: public opinion, economic security, and government transparency. At the moment, defensive realism appears to be the preferred trend in the American mind. Living costs continue to rise, and Congress is beginning to resist giving as much aid to places of conflict. There are increases in reports from densely populated areas regarding a lack of health and safety. If the American people have greater domestic interests, there's a chance that the tide would shift in the other direction. Maybe we'll start to see more base development in the states to deal with the rise in public unrest like in the early 20th century. Leadership and party objectives would inevitably play a role. That said, money talks. Finance will always play a role on the world stage. Ever since Nixon's decision to abandon the gold standard, the US dollar has become a questionable default currency for the rest of the world. Now called the de-dollarization movement, this retaliation towards the US has come with its fair share of challenges. For the uninitiated, overseas trade routes may seem like a small concern, but there are pathways that would completely cripple the US economy if blocked. An example of this would be Djibouti, a country sitting across from Yemen, separated by the Bab al-Mandab Strait. This 28-kilometer-wide pathway is the only way to get from the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden, and is second to the Suez Canal for transporting valuable resources, specifically oil. Meaning, if this route were to be taken away, an almost incalculable amount of wealth would be lost. For this reason, it's a hotspot for bases belonging to both sides of the aisle, including the US, Italy, China, France, and Japan. The US will never give up their base at the capital or any other profitable locations. This brings us to the issue of transparency. The truth is, we probably will never know exactly how many bases exist. The 21st century has revealed that the US government isn't too keen on sharing information. Plus, even if subjected to an audit, they find ways to satisfy public inquiry if they don't have a clear answer. Aside from the occasional leak, much of the citizenry feels like they're left in the dark when it comes to foreign operations. Just recently, the Pentagon used author David Vine's database to share how many foreign bases are currently active. This either means that the government can't keep track of how many bases are established across the globe, or they use these records in order to save themselves the burden of scrubbing bases from their own personal records. All in all, it's probably a safe bet that the US will continue to pay, or force, their way into base-building deals. If diplomacy continues to fail, a military presence appears to be the country's best bet for maintaining order. Construction will most likely increase in both domestic and foreign territory to manage the populace here and abroad.